Yes, there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, but it's not what you think. We keep hearing that traditional masculinity is in itself toxic, but today I'm going to prove to you that that's just not true. If you're new here, my name is Roni, and on this channel, we dive deep into human nature to help us become everything we're meant to be. In this video, I'm going to explain what it really means for masculinity to become toxic, and I'm going to talk about the 4 archetypal profiles of toxic masculine behavior: the Barbarian, the Tyrant, the Womanizer, and the Evil Genius. Yes, there are bad men out there, but that doesn't mean that all men are bad. Stick with me to the end if you want to understand what the real difference is between healthy masculinity and toxic masculinity. Let's get started. You hear a lot of people today saying that masculinity is in itself toxic, but really, no one knows what toxic masculinity actually is.
Do you think that toxic masculinity is a problem that we need to address in society?
In society, I'd say it definitely is something we should address.
It's definitely an issue that most of us face in some way or another.
I definitely think it is an issue at large.
I've absolutely heard of toxic masculinity, and I do think it's an issue.
I think it's a huge issue that should be addressed.
It's a real problem. How would you define toxic masculinity as a term in your own words?
Toxic masculinity, I would define as...
There isn't a sort of logic to it. I feel like it's more just strutting your stuff and being manly beyond there being a point to be.
I don't really know.
The idea that men have to be a certain way, dominant, physically imposing and all, and to the extent where...
and these constructs are not necessarily conducive to building strong relationships between different members.
Then you hear people saying that traditional masculinity is itself the problem.
We're rejecting traditional masculinity. We're rejecting traditional masculinity because it's toxic, and it's toxic because it's powerful. That traditional masculinity is harmful to men, that it is the cause and the result of a power imbalance, which it continues to propagate, and that the power playing field is being leveled out due to changing gender roles, and controlling traditional masculinity unleashes tremendous benefits for society.
The fact that there was a debate at the Oxford Union about whether or not traditional masculinity is toxic is fucking hilarious. Now, you might be thinking, these are just some silly college students talking nonsense. But these ideas have serious consequences. There's a real mental health crisis in boys and men today. And the messaging they're getting is that traditional masculinity is the reason for it.
Men are 3.5 times more likely to commit suicide than women, and it is the leading cause of death for men under 35. Men are occupying the top jobs and making the most money, but they also form over 90% of the prison population. They suffer more academic challenges. The most underperforming demographic group in the UK is the white working class male. Men are simultaneously the top of society and the bottom of the pile. This proves that something is wrong, and the common denominator is traditional masculinity.
But here's the thing. Traditional masculinity is not the problem. It's the fact that for several generations now, we've been making men feel guilty for being men. And we certainly haven't been letting boys be boys. And if we don't learn to distinguish between healthy masculinity and toxic masculinity, the crisis is only going to get worse. So what is toxic masculinity? Simply put, toxic masculinity can be described as behaviors that are masculine in nature, evolutionarily speaking, which are used in ways that are destructive, aggressive, manipulative, and/or exploitative. Here's a perfect example.
The dirty little secret about toxic masculinity. When properly explained, there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, just like there's such a thing as toxic femininity. Here's the devil in the details that a lot of the people that use those terms don't like to admit. As soon as they say that, you know what they're admitting to? Binary. They're actually admitting that there are masculine traits and that there are feminine traits. When we look at things like aggression or competitiveness or a capacity for violence, these traits are morally neutral until they're actually put into action. So the man that uses that aggression or that competitiveness or that capacity for violence to take a woman's purse and run down the street, that is a negative manifestation of a masculine trait. Then when the other man steps in and stops him and returns it, those are positive manifestations of those masculine traits. So this is not a question of whether or not the traits will exist. It's a question of whether or not they will receive positive manifestations and positive outworkings or negative ones.
Masculine energy is strong. It's potent. It has the potential to be channeled into industry, innovation, and the building of empires. And it can also be channeled into senseless violence, bloodshed, and endless misery. Masculinity is powerful. And as the saying goes,
with great power comes great responsibility.
So when does masculinity become toxic? When it isn't developed within a moral framework. Masculine energy is so powerful that it does have the potential to create real physical harm. But that's why, for centuries, men went through initiation rites that symbolized their transformation from boys into men and were guided by strong, wise, honorable men. These rites of passage taught these young men how to harness their incredible strength and energy into meaningful, virtuous pursuits. This is where young men were taught code of honor and discipline. They were allowed to develop their masculine virtues and were taught how to not let these virtues turn into vices. Masculinity, if not balanced with empathy, honor, and a strong value system, can become dangerous. But with the right guidance and the right roadmap, it can be the source of tremendous good. So before we dive into the 4 archetypes of toxic masculinity, it's important to understand what masculine traits actually are. In order to understand when masculinity turns dangerous, we need to understand what it is in the first place. I hear a lot of people fumbling with this and saying that we need to redefine what masculinity is.
We're actually trying to redefine what it means to be a man, and none of us have any idea because we're just out here trying to be whoever we are.
That's right. I think that historically, being a man was rooted in patriarchy and misogyny. And now we realize how harmful that has been over the years. And so we don't really know how to define where we're supposed to be.
Sorry to tell you this, but you're not going to redefine hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And part of the problem is that men think that redefining masculinity means that they need to become more feminine.
But maybe more broadly, there's a danger that we treat men like malfunctioning women. So your problem is you're not feminine enough, you're not caring enough, you're not nurturing enough, you're not emotionally vulnerable enough, you don't cry enough, you don't spend enough time with your kids.
Okay, so what is masculinity? Masculinity is characterized by dominance, aggression, analytical over emotional thinking, risk-taking, and hierarchical organization. Masculinity has evolved for warfare and hunting. This means that men needed to evolve their ability to be aggressive, calm under pressure, and more risk-seeking than risk-averse. Because men had to coordinate and cooperate in groups in order to successfully hunt and protect their tribes from invaders, they developed an innate sense of hierarchical organization. While they compete for dominance, they are also able to cooperate with one another if it means that their group will become more successful. And for anyone who thinks men's aggression is socially conditioned, I've got news for you. It's an inherent biological trait that is seen early on in boys. Joyce Benenson wrote a book called Warriors and Worriers: The Survival of the Sexes, where she observed the natural play behaviors of young children. And here's what she found. Most little boys enjoy play fighting. Play fighting is often called rough and tumble play in the objective wording of the biological and psychological literatures. This, of course, disguises its basic quality, fighting and loving it. In fact, the only way to distinguish play fighting from real fighting is the laughter and lack of anger that accompany the play version. By the time little boys are old enough to interact enjoyably with one another, toward the end of infancy, play fighting is one of their favorite activities. Even boys who don't feel comfortable with actual play fighting because they're less sociable, smaller, or less coordinated than other boys still enjoy observing it from a distance or engaging in it virtually through computer or video games, or in former days, books. The enjoyment that play fighting provides continues well into adolescence and even in some places into adulthood. Good luck socially conditioning them out of that. I'm going to be making a whole other video on what happens to boys' development if this kind of boisterous playing is suppressed. So look out for that. So what is the barbarian? Simply put, the barbarian is the warrior who uses his power and aggression for senseless destruction and violence. He's the man possessed by the sin of wrath. He's the toxic version of the honorable warrior archetype. A positive manifestation of the warrior archetype is a man who uses his physical power and aggression to protect his wife, children, and his people. He operates based on a code of honor, courage, self-sacrifice, and love for his fellow man. But the barbarian engages in violence for its own sake. He doesn't care who he hurts because through his aggression, he feels more powerful. This is the warrior with no morality. He gets a high from causing pain and destruction wherever he goes. It can even give him an ego boost and make him feel untouchable. Now, all of these archetypes score high on the dark tetrad traits, which are well-researched personality scores of antisocial behavior. Now, each one of these toxic archetypes has their own particular combination of traits. The Barbarian scores especially high on sadism and psychopathy. Sadism is defined as deriving pleasure from causing pain, humiliation, or suffering to others, whether physically, emotionally, or socially. Simply put, the sadist actually enjoys seeing other people suffer. Psychopathy is defined by a total lack of empathy, impulsive behavior, and a lack of guilt or remorse. They're often thrill-seeking, fearless, and completely unconcerned with the consequences of their actions. The combination of these two traits, along with the natural male traits of aggression and dominance, can have deadly consequences. Now, I hope you can see that it's not the capacity for aggression that's the problem here. It's when it's combined with these antisocial traits that it actually becomes toxic. Now, a universal type of barbarian, who we've all probably met at some point in our lives, is the schoolyard bully. There's always one in every school who gets off on making other boys' lives miserable. He enjoys beating up the weak boys. It's a game for him. Just a bit of fun. An ancient mythological version of this archetype is the Greek god Ares, the god of war. Ares embodies the chaotic, brutal, and destructive aspects of war. He's the personification of raw violence, bloodlust, and the unpredictable nature of battle. He gets lost in the passion and frenzy of the battle. Throughout history, human barbarians have channeled and embodied the Ares archetype. The Visigoths who invaded Rome were literally called the barbarians at the gate. These are the Vikings who pillaged and terrorized northern and western Europe. These are the Mongols under Genghis Khan who conquered a continent through terror and a lust for bloodshed. A man who has a strong capacity for violence is not necessarily evil or toxic. These are your soldiers and police officers risking their lives for a noble cause, the honorable warriors. But the barbarian is a man who has a strong capacity for violence, who was never initiated into manhood by mature, virtuous men. Psychologically speaking, the barbarian was never taught how to control his aggression. He has zero impulse control and can turn violent at the smallest insult. Violence is the only tool he has to assert his manhood. The barbarian usually finds a brotherhood of other immature young men who only reinforce this ethos of manhood through destructive violence. A great book on this is The Warrior Ethos by Stephen Pressfield. He compares the groups of barbarians as shadow tribes and explains how they differ greatly from true, honorable warriors. Criminal and terrorist organizations practice tribe-like codes of honor, but they don't practice the warrior ethos. They are shadow tribes. They are not warriors. In the practice of terror, in fact, the terrorist organization uses the enemy's embrace of the warrior ethos against him. How? By violating the honorable tribal warrior code in the most shocking and extreme manner, striking civilian targets, using women and children as human shields, etc. I know a thing or two about that, unfortunately. And I hope you'll start to notice one of the key features that all these toxic masculine archetypes share. The only way they know how to feel like men is through these toxic behaviors, because they've never learned any other way. Men need to prove their manhood. There's no way around it. But if they don't have healthy masculine role models to show them the way, they never learn how to use their masculine power for good. Another real-life example of the barbarian are your typical drug gangs. These are the kinds of men who are constantly killing each other over territory without any care for the consequences. They use their physical aggression, guns, and love for violence to terrify everyone around them. These are the gangs who don't mind if they don't kill a few innocent bystanders in a drive-by shooting. It's no wonder that they tattoo a teardrop on their face to show off that they've murdered somebody. They derive a sense of pride and satisfaction when they kill, and that's the only way they know how to feel like men. The more severe version of this, and far more violent, are the drug cartels in Latin America. These cartels use murder and torture to create a reign of terror. Often their own governments are powerless in the face of the sheer violence. It doesn't help that they're all coked up, making their psychopathic thrill-seeking and lack of guilt even worse. And an example that is far too close to home are the filthy Hamas terrorists who invaded my country on October 7th and butchered, massacred, sexually mutilated, beheaded, and burned thousands of innocent Israelis. They were high on meth, hate, and unholy rage. And you know the worst part? They enjoyed it. Evil is often gleeful. Newsflash, the Barbarian is real. He's an eternal archetype that has existed throughout the dawn of time. And the only thing that stands between you and the monster are the brave, strong, virtuous men who are willing to put their lives on the line in order to protect you. Healthy masculinity is all the thousands of men who drove directly into the line of fire to protect their families and fellow countrymen. If you think toxic masculinity is a guy who's manspreading in the subway, you don't have your head screwed on straight. And you've clearly lived a very sheltered, comfortable life. But with all that said, the Barbarian is a man who is terrified of looking weak. Usually, this kind of man felt weak and defenseless as a child. He was on the receiving end of physical abuse growing up, and he learned that the person who had the most power in every situation was the most violent man who could do the most damage. And unconsciously, he learned that by becoming violent and terrifying, he would never feel weak and defenseless as he did as a child. A key point here is that he almost always turns his aggression toward women because he denies any bit of him that might be vulnerable or emotional. He equates femininity with weakness and abuses women to repress that own weakness in himself. In terms of sexual violence, when an opportunity presents itself, he takes it. Most often, these are the kind of men who don't have a good woman in their lives, and this is their chance to satisfy themselves and take what they want by force. One key finding that supports this is that polygamous societies are often more violent. In a fantastic book on the origins of monogamy called Marriage and Civilization, William Tucker writes the following: societies that are polygamous to begin with go to war precisely because they have created an imbalance by letting each man take more than one wife. This creates a demand for women that can only be resolved by stealing women from other tribes. Thus, warfare and polygamy become mutually reinforcing. Of course, all civilizations have violent elements and have been involved in wars of conquest, but the most violent civilizations are those of polygamous, nomadic warriors. If a man doesn't have a wife and a family to morally ground him and give his life meaning, he is much more likely to turn into the barbarian. There is nothing more dangerous than aimless, unmarried men.
So when you have a whole cohort of young men who are not going to college, not having the same economic opportunities, and quite frankly have no or little prospects for a romantic relationship, you generate the most dangerous person in the world. And that is a lonely, broke young man. That is any society that's violent, any society that has revolutions, any society that engages in religious extremist behavior has a disproportionate number of this cohort.
Now let's talk about the tyrant archetype. The tyrant is the toxic version of the benevolent king. He's the man possessed by the sin of pride and envy. The tyrant is essentially the king, father, boss, or leader who uses his power to control his people and rules with an iron fist. This is the man who uses fear, terror, and abuse to keep his kingdom in line, whether it be his business or his family. Moore describes the tyrant like this: the tyrant exploits and abuses others. He is ruthless, merciless, and without feeling when he's pursuing what he thinks is his own self-interest. His degradation of others knows no bounds. He hates all beauty, all innocence, all strength, all talent, all life energy. In terms of the dark tetrad traits, the tyrant is characterized by especially high levels of narcissism and Machiavellianism. His narcissism is usually of the grandiose variety. Grandiose narcissism is characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance and entitlement. The grandiose narcissist needs the admiration of others. He's arrogant and has no empathy for others. But the thing is, while grandiose narcissists project confidence and superiority, they are highly sensitive to criticism or challenges to their self-image. Now, his Machiavellianism makes him manipulative and exploitative. He views others simply as tools to be used for his own personal gain. He's skilled at deceit and strategic thinking. which often helps him gain his position of power. A classic historical example of a true tyrant is Genghis Khan. He ruled and conquered by terrorizing, murdering, and pillaging entire peoples. His only concern was to amass more power and wealth, and no doubt had a taste for the violent destruction that he caused. At one point, his Mongolian empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe. The tyrant is a leader who's wholly focused on his own self-interest. These are your mob bosses, drug lords, corporate executives, and pimps. All they care about is furthering their own status, gaining power, and making money at the expense of others. This greed and willingness to exploit can stem from a deep, unconscious feeling of lack. Some tyrants grew up with nothing or were themselves terrorized by a tyrant father. And at some point, they made the decision, sometimes without realizing it, that they will never feel weak and small again, and that they'll do absolutely anything to make it to the top. But before we feel too much sympathy for these tyrants, it's good to remember that most simply have an insatiable hunger for power. In normal life, this is the tyrant boss who creates a workplace dominated by fear instead of respect, where employees are too intimidated to challenge or question any of his authority. He overworks his employees relentlessly, demanding excessive hours and unreasonable results to fuel his own ambitions. If any of his employees show too much talent or competence, he makes sure to suppress them, lest they outshine him. Instead of mentoring employees or fostering their growth, he berates them and undermines them to keep them subordinate. The types he usually does promote are yes men, who are mindlessly loyal to him and who he can easily manipulate. His primary goal is to consolidate power, ensuring that the people around him remain dependent on his decisions. He divides and conquers by pitting employees against each other to maintain control. Over time, the toxic culture that he creates breeds resentment and high turnover. Ultimately, very few organizations can last under this kind of leadership. The tyrant father rules his household with an iron fist. Robert Moore gives a great explanation of the father who's possessed by the tyrant archetype. It is the shadow king as tyrant in the father who makes war on his sons and his daughters' joy and strength, their abilities and vitalities. He fears their freshness, their newness of being, and the life force surging through them, and he seeks to kill it. He does this with open verbal assaults and depreciation of their interests, hopes, and talents. Or he does it, alternately, by ignoring their accomplishments, turning his back on their disappointments, and registering boredom and lack of interest when, for instance, they come home from school and present him with a piece of artwork or a good grade on a test. His attacks may not be limited to verbal or psychological abuse. They may include physical abuse. Spankings may turn into beatings, and there may be sexual assaults as well. The father possessed by the tyrant may sexually exploit his daughters or even his son's weakness and vulnerability. If you grew up with a tyrant father, this probably sounds all too familiar. He made sure to crush your spirits every chance he got. Again, this stems from the tyrant father's paranoia of his children surpassing him in any way. His strict, draconian rules leave everyone feeling suffocated, and by keeping his children terrified of stepping out of line, he's able to tighten his control. Some children are simply crushed by his abuse and never really recover, and others grow up to be deeply angry, hateful men. As a husband, he controls every aspect of his wife's life. He sees her as his property. In his mind, her purpose is to serve his needs. He doesn't see her as a human being, let alone as his partner. He starts off by isolating her from her loved ones, sometimes in an innocent-seeming way. Once he cuts her off from her support systems, she becomes dependent on him, which is exactly the way he likes it. That way, he has even more control. Sometimes he'll frame his controlling behavior as protecting her. He has to know exactly where she is at all times. He dictates how much money she can spend, and he'll often accuse her of cheating in a violent, jealous rage. Often this just stems from his own paranoia, and it's another useful way of terrorizing her into submission. Needless to say, a woman who lives with this kind of man has every last bit of her identity and self-worth squeezed out of her, until there's nothing left. Heaven help her if she tries to escape from his clutches. The tyrant husband never responds well to that. As I've been hinting at, one of the key features of the tyrant is that he's terrified of being usurped. If his subjects show any sign of competence or leadership, he takes them out immediately because he's terrified of them taking his place. His paranoia of being overthrown is one of the things that drives him to terrorize his subjects. This paranoia can turn murderous. In the Soviet Union, for example, Joseph Stalin carried out the Great Purge. In this mass execution, his paranoia drove him to execute anywhere between 70 to 90% of his commanding officers. The higher-ranked ones were almost all executed. Stalin was so paranoid that disloyalty was brewing in his ranks, and this is what drove him to kill more Soviet generals and colonels that fell in World War II. The thing is, all tyrants are at some point overthrown, making their paranoia justified, you might say. Even in bands of chimpanzees, tyrannical alpha males don't last as long as the empathetic ones. Frans de Waal was a genius primatologist who wrote several books on primate social behavior and political dynamics. He found that the stable alpha males acted like benevolent kings. In his book Mama's Last Hug, he writes the following: competent alpha males in chimpanzee societies often adopt a control role, pacifying conflicts by intervening impartially. They may disperse fights by physically separating combatants or through displays of dominance that emphasize authority rather than aggression. This impartiality fosters stability within the group and earns them long-term respect. The sharing of resources by alpha males highlights their political savvy and benevolence. An alpha strategically distributed meat, often without consuming it himself, to strengthen alliances with non-threatening individuals. This generosity prolonged his dominance for over a decade, illustrating how giving rather than hoarding resources can solidify power. Now, the tyrannical alpha males, on the other hand, did not last long. They were eventually taken out by a coalition of younger males who were tired of their rule of terror. The aggressive alpha males are most often taken out by a coalition of younger males. In his book Good Natured, de Waal elaborates on this. Two male chimpanzees team up to overthrow an aggressive and unfair ruler, waging a war of nerves for weeks or months. They support each other through intimidation displays and actual confrontations until the alpha is forced out of power. This highly coordinated coalition highlights how group members react to dominance perceived as excessive or unjust. Even in our primate cousins, the tyrant never lasts. An example from Greek mythology of a tyrant being overthrown is the defeat of Kronos by his son Zeus. Kronos was so terrified of being usurped by his children that he swallowed each of them as soon as they were born. Like the devouring mother who keeps her children dependent on her and doesn't allow them to grow, the tyrant father will always value his own power over the lives of his children. He will keep them small and weak to make sure they will never be able to disturb his reign of tyranny. In order to protect Zeus, Rhea devised a plan to hide him in a cave in Crete, where he could grow up without the knowledge of his father Kronos. To trick Kronos, Rhea handed him a stone instead of Zeus, which he readily swallowed like all his other children. When Zeus was fully grown and ready, he defeated his father and rescued his siblings. And here we have yet another example of the benevolent king being favored over the tyrant. Even in the Disney movie The Lion King, we have another example of the tyrant being overthrown by a younger coalition. Mufasa is the benevolent Lion King who his evil brother Scar murders to gain power. He terrorizes his lion pride and uses his army of barbaric hyenas to enforce his rule and maintain control. Eventually, when Simba grows up and is strong enough, he and Nala overthrow Scar. Simba becomes the new benevolent king and restores peaceful order and harmony in his kingdom. Another historical example is the assassination of Julius Caesar. We often hear about the story as if Caesar was betrayed by Brutus and his other senators, but really, we rarely hear about the fact that Caesar had declared himself dictator for life. He began to consolidate more and more power, undermining the Republic and the Senate. Whenever a king or a leader of any kind turns into a dictator, his days are numbered. The paradox of the tyrant archetype is that his evil often stems from a deep insecurity and weakness. Moore writes, The man possessed by the tyrant is very sensitive to criticism, and though putting on a threatening front, will at the slightest remark feel weak and deflated. He won't show you this, however. What you will see, unless you know what to look for, is rage. But under the rage is a sense of worthlessness, vulnerability, and weakness. The tyrant lacks real substance, and he knows it. In order to become the benevolent king, a man must balance his leadership with the sense of duty towards others. Like Marcus Aurelius writes in Meditations, if you have been placed in a position above others, are you automatically going to behave like a despot? Remember who you are and who you govern, that they are kinsmen, brothers by nature, fellow descendants of Zeus. That last line is key because it shows that he doesn't try to make himself a god. Instead, he puts himself on the same level as his fellow man. Now for the sex addict archetype. The sex addict is the toxic version of the lover. He's the man possessed by the sin of lust. The sex addict will do anything to satisfy his appetite for sex. This can be the womanizer, the cheating husband, or the porn addict. This can come in many shapes and many forms. It's the womanizer, or fuckboy, so to speak, who seduces women and discards them once he's had his fix. It's the cheating husband who's willing to betray his wife for cheap thrills with other women. It's the man who can't stop watching porn, cutting himself off from any real human connection, and becomes disgusted with himself in the process. Speaking of the dark tetrad traits, the sex addict is characterized by especially high levels of narcissism. He feels entitled to his pleasures and disregards the damage he does to the women he sleeps with. He's arrogant and superior, and in some real way, feels that the rules don't apply to him. He's able to use his grandiose charm to lure women into his web, and only sees them for what they can do for him. The men who are addicted to porn, on the other hand, are usually not grandiose narcissists, and probably have a hard time interacting with others. If anything, they might score high on vulnerable narcissism. This means that they're still self-centered and feel that they deserve more than is given to them, but they're also usually more introverted and depressed. They constantly feel like the world does not appreciate their unique abilities and value. And so they don't mind engaging in the demeaning practice of watching porn and paying girls to do all sorts of unmentionable things for them on screen. Let's start by diving into the womanizer archetype. This fuckboy type uses his charm to get women into bed and then carelessly discards them. The thing about the womanizer is that he understands women well. He knows how to get inside their heads and tell them exactly what they want to hear. He makes them feel special and desired. Sometimes he opens up to them and creates a facade of deep sincerity. He'll lie through his teeth and tell them that he's never felt like this before. Sometimes he'll go as far as to tell them that he's looking for a serious relationship. And all of that charisma and charm makes it easy for him to lure women into his bed again and again. He pays no mind to the broken hearts he leaves behind. He's in it for his own self-gratification, for the ego boost he gets every time he lands another conquest. He becomes addicted to that cycle of chase, ecstasy, and ego boost. Once he's conquered a woman, it's on to the next one, and so the cycle continues. So the womanizer is in it for that high, for that ecstasy and sexual gratification. He's not in it for the intimacy or feeling of union with another person. Needless to say, many women have been burned by this kind of man, especially the younger ones. As a woman matures, she starts to develop a sense for the womanizer, but the younger women become entranced by his charm and are easy prey. One reason the sex addict chases these sexual highs is to escape from his own internal disorder. He unconsciously searches for that wholeness outside of himself. And beyond the sensual element, he uses sex to affirm his own masculinity and self-worth, especially when he feels deep down that he's not a real man. He'll show off to his buddies about his latest conquests, but this is really a way for him to mask his deep lack of self-worth. He lacks discipline and true meaning. Another manifestation of the sex addict is the cheating husband. This is the type of man who is led by his sexual appetite, so much so that he's willing to throw away his commitment to his wife. His desire for the thrill and excitement of sleeping with another woman, often younger, overtakes his love and faithfulness. This is the kind of man who's pulled by his baser instincts and succumbs to instant gratification. The cheating husband can often keep his betrayals secret and going on for years. His narcissism disconnects him from the emotional consequences that his behaviors can have on his wife, and it leads him to feel like he's entitled to these extramarital pleasures, as if the expectation of being with one woman for the rest of his life is out of question. On the other hand, we have the porn addict. This is the type who consumes endless content that demeans and objectifies women. Sex is good, but porn is not sex. Porn is extreme and violent. Porn isn't sexual union with another. It's a quick fix. The porn addict becomes a slave to the dopamine hit he gets from watching porn. He grows more disgusted with himself as time goes by, and he's essentially another manifestation of a man who has completely succumbed to the instant gratification of his sexual appetite. A mythological representation of the sex addict is the Greek god Dionysus. He had many other different facets, some of them positive, but Dionysus also represents sensual indulgence. He was the god of wine, which symbolized intoxication, pleasure, and ecstasy. Camille Paglia describes him like this: the Dionysian is no picnic. Dionysus is energy, ecstasy, hysteria, promiscuity, emotionalism, heedless indiscriminateness of idea or practice. Dionysus is energy unbound, mad, callous, destructive, wasteful. This is the force and energy driving the sex addict. The thing is, the sex addict's chase and addiction to pleasure doesn't only hurt others. Ultimately, like any good addict, he cycles through extreme pleasure and the inevitable crash. Jean Shinoda Bolen describes a man possessed by the Dionysian spirit like this: the Dionysian archetype is one of intense sensuality and emotionality, often overwhelming for those who embody it. In relationships, this manifests as passionate highs and tumultuous lows, captivating partners but also leaving them destabilized. The Dionysus man lives for the present, seeking ecstatic experiences that dissolve the barriers of individuality. However, his intensity can lead to fragmentation, as he struggles to reconcile his impulses with societal expectations. To embrace this archetype is to walk a fine line between bliss and despair. We all need the element of the lover in our lives. The problem happens when a man loses himself to this force and becomes single-minded and callous in his pursuit of lust and ecstasy. The Dionysian, if tamed, can inject our life with a sense of play, wonder, and joy. A healthy man is able to love and relate to others. He allows himself to enjoy life and open himself up to joy. This kind of energy can be cultivated in those who don't have access to it. And as for the sex addict, in the best of cases, life sends him a sober wake-up call. Now on to the evil genius. The evil genius is the toxic version of the wise man. He's the toxic version of the innovator, the scholar, and the sage. He's the man possessed by the sin of greed. Simply put, the evil genius archetype is the man who uses his intelligence for his own personal gain, without a care for the destructive consequences. He can also manifest as the negative element of the trickster. In terms of the dark tetrad personality traits, he's the kind of man who would score high on Machiavellianism and narcissism. He has zero empathy and is very comfortable stepping on people to get ahead. He's the man who uses intelligence to further himself financially without any regard for the destructive consequences. This is the lawyer who defends murderers and keeps them on the street as long as it benefits his own bank account. These are your corporate bosses who are willing to lay off hundreds of workers or completely dismantle their company if it means they make a profit. They're perfectly fine with cheating people out of their fortunes if it benefits them. These are the executives in Big Pharma who don't care that they're causing an opioid crisis. These are your historic advertising executives on Madison Avenue who use their marketing brilliance to manipulate consumers into endless consumption. Today, it would be the owners of big tech social media platforms who seem completely unconcerned with the fact that they've destroyed the mental health of whole generations of children and young adults. And essentially, this is the driver of crony capitalism, where intelligent men with zero morals enable an absurd transfer of wealth which disproportionately increases the wealth gap even more. And just to be clear, I'm 100% for capitalism. It's the rigging of the system that I'm against. A great example of this is Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. If you haven't seen it, watch it immediately. He's the big shot on Wall Street whose only concern is to make money, leaving scorched earth behind him. He'll rig the system to make money, even if it means destroying someone else in the process. When he promises to buy an airline, for example, to save it and its workers, he immediately turns around on his promise and starts to dismantle the airline and sell it for parts. Every decision and action is the use of his remarkable intelligence for his own personal gain. Dr. Frankenstein is yet another example of the evil genius. He uses his intelligence and knowledge to literally create a monster, which is a symbolic way to describe what happens when an evil genius misuses his power. An archetypal description of the evil genius is the Luciferian instinct. This is a man who places his own intelligence above any other value, whether it be God or the well-being of anyone around him. Because of his superior intelligence, he believes that this gives him the right to use his abilities in whichever way he sees fit, no matter the consequence. The Luciferian man is cynical. He feels that everything in the end is meaningless, and so everything is permissible. A classic character who embodies the Luciferian instinct is Ivan from Dostoevsky's Karamazov Brothers, the more analytical and intellectual out of the three brothers. In the book, Ivan famously says, "If there is no God, everything is lawful." He believes in nothing, and so allows himself anything. He's cynical, arrogant, superior, and detached. And a key element of this type is his detachment from others, which allows him to act without feeling. For an example of the negative expression of the trickster archetype, the Joker from Batman is the classic example. While tricksters can serve a positive role by revealing our blind spots and awakening our consciousness, the Joker exists purely to spread chaos and destruction. His permanently carved smile symbolizes his delight in pain and chaos, and he makes sure to dish it out in the most creative and unexpected ways. He uses his wit to constantly outsmart Batman and wreak havoc, because that's all part of the fun. The genius archetype has many positive manifestations. It has the power to drive innovation and industry. As the wise man, this archetype is the mentor and male guide that helps others with their transformations. This is the man who can further human knowledge. But like anything, it can turn toxic if it isn't tamed and balanced with discipline and empathy. So there you have it. These are the true toxic masculine archetypes. Toxic masculinity does not equal traditional masculinity. Masculinity becomes toxic only when operating without a moral framework and its energies aren't properly channeled. What I hope you take away from this video is that if you're trying to develop your masculinity, that does not make you toxic. The world needs you to become a man. We need more strong, virtuous men, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If this is an area you've been struggling with in any way, you're more than welcome to reach out. Till next time, guys.